In this video we are going to have a look at the game Hikaru Nakamura played in round 9 of the FIDE Grand Swiss. He's playing with the white pieces against Ivan Cheparinov from Bulgaria, and it's a very important game because the question is if Hikaru is able to catch up with the leaders. He is currently on 5.5 out of 8. There are 4 players with 6 out of 8. They are half a point ahead of Hikaru, and Hikaru needs to play for a win to catch up with them, so he is fighting for a spot in the candidates tournament. Let's have a look if he is capable of winning a game against very strong grandmaster. So Hikaru is playing the move e4, and after e5, knight f3, knight f6. Black is choosing one of the most solid defenses out there, the Petrov opening. Knight takes e5, d6, knight f3, knight takes e4. And here Hikaru decides to not go for the main lines, and well, usually white goes for the move d4, but with the move c4 he wants to avoid a theoretical battle, and it's a very clever choice, I think, because Cheparinov is very well known for his openings. He's a true opening specialist. He has been working for a lot of top guys, including former world champion Veselin Topalov. So he's trying to get a game out of this solid opening. Let's see if that works out well for white. Bishop e7, d4, d5. So black is trying to hold on to that knight on e4. Bishop d3, undermining that knight, but okay, the knight is still defended by the pawn on d5. Black is giving a check. So here the king has a problem to solve. White does it by means of knight bd2, interfering with the knight, and after both sides castling, black brings out the bishop to f5. So objectively speaking, it's pretty balanced game so far. Both sides have some nice ideas to get their pieces into the game. And here, white goes for the move knight to b3. And normally in these Petrov structures, the knight is on the c3 square. But here on b3, it looks a bit odd. But, well, it definitely has some advantages as well. After d takes c4, bishop takes c4, white has an isolated queen pawn. And this pawn can usually become a weakness if black is able to target it. But, okay, right now with the knight on b3, the pawn is pretty well defended. And interestingly, up to this point, the players have been following a game of Fabiano Caruana against Anish Giri back in 2011. This game was played in Reggio Emilia. It was the very first super tournament Anish Giri managed to win, so he had probably some nice memories when walking through the playing hall seeing this particular opening variation. Knight c6 was played by Anish, and Ivan Cheparinov goes here for the move knight to d7. It's a little bit more passive. I like knight c6 better, but definitely black is doing okay. White goes for the move a3, questioning the bishop. Bishop goes back to e7, bishop d3. So white is about to put more pressure on that knight on e4, which is no longer defended by a pawn on d5. Bishop g6, rook e1, and the knight goes back to d6. Bishops are getting exchanged, and well, it has to be said that these knights, they look a little bit strange, but still no problems here whatsoever. Knight a5 was played, and what is Hikaru going to do with that knight there? The pawn is still defended by the knight on d6, but after knight b6 there is this move bishop f4. So the plan is to eliminate that that knight, followed by capturing the pawn on b7. And how should black cope with that threat? Well, I think queen d7 is a very clever move. You're indirectly protecting that pawn, because after bishop takes d6, black has the idea of recapturing with a pawn, and there are no problems here whatsoever. However, Cheparinov decided to play here the move knight f5. He's a very active player, and he doesn't want to play solid chess, so it's a remarkable decision, as it's a full pawn sacrifice. There is knight takes b7, white captures the pawn, threatens the queen goes to d5, and now the knight comes back to c5. White is a pawn up, but there are some tactical ideas. First of all, after bishop takes c5, attempting to regain the pawn, white has the move rook e5, in between move, attacking the queen. If the queen goes away, you capture with the rook the bishop. That's not possible. The other idea is to take the pawn on d4 with a knight, but that hangs the bishop on e7. After rook takes e7, you can capture first on f3 and white takes back. You can take on c5. So it looks as if material is even, but at the end of the line, there is still rook takes c7 and white emerges with an extra pawn. So there's no way black is able to win the pawn back immediately. Therefore, Cheparinov played bishop d6, trying to trade off that annoying bishop so the pawn on c7 is not hanging. After bishop takes, pawn takes, black attacks the knight on c5, the knight goes back, rook e8, attacking the knight on e4 one more time, queen d3, white is consolidating its position with the extra pawn. Black is looking for counterplay. With the move knight a4, he's attacking that pawn on b2. White goes b3 to attack the knight. The knight goes to c5. That's a funny move, because if you do take with a pawn, the queen on d3 will be hanging. So you gotta take with a knight. After d takes c5, the pawn on d4 is pinned. So it looks as if you're able to win the pawn back now as black. But Hikaru, of course, had calculated all of this, went for the move rook takes e8, black recaptures, and now queen b5, attacking the rook on e8. Very important detail. So after rook c8, you can safely capture that pawn on c5. Of course, if you do take with a rook, it's queen e8 check. And this is really problematic, because after king h7, the knight comes into g5, followed by taking on f7. So let's take it back. And of course, Cheparinov goes for the exchange of queens. But generally, that's not what you want to do when you're material down. You want to keep pieces on the board. But here, black had no choice. Queen takes c5, rook takes c5. And here we see the smoke has cleared. White has a very nice 2 versus 1. Goes for the move rook to d1, attempting to enter black's position with that rook, going after the pawn on a7 very soon. Rook c3 could be met now by the move rook d8 check. And that's the problem, because after king h7, the knight comes once again to g5. And after king h6, you capture the pawn on f7 with check. So there's no time for black to deliver a back rank mate. So let's take it back. We understand now why black played here the move f6, so to control the g5 square, preventing the knight from coming there. And here, I think it's a very technical, difficult position to convert for white. I mean, you have to play very precisely, and it's not easy at all. Something like rook d8, it's very tempting. But in the game, white started here with the move g4 to attack the knight on f5. But I have my doubts this is the right way of playing. I don't think you really want to expand with your pawns on that side of the board. It will initiate more pawn exchanges later on. But Hikaru has a very concrete idea in mind, because with the move g4, apart from attacking the knight, you're also solving all your back rank problems. Knight h6, the knight attacks the pawn, the rook comes in, the king goes away, because if you go to the other side, it's rook to d7, and white is picking up that pawn on a7. And with 2 connected passed pawns, black's defensive job will be very difficult. So king h7, now the rook comes back to d4, keeping that pawn on g4 protected. Very nice idea, so that the black king is a little bit further away from the center. Rook c3, here black is looking for counterplay, attacking both the knight and the pawn. The knight comes back to d2 to protect the pawn. Knight to f7, and here I would say that bringing the king to the center is the right strategy. If your king is on e2, you can try to play rook d3, offer the exchange of rooks, and step by step you're trying to improve your position. But white had a different idea in mind, played here the move h4, and now black goes for g5. And that's a good move, because you're looking for pawn exchanges. Pawn takes g5, knight takes g5 was played. And here still, I'm thinking this plan of getting the king to the center to play the move rook d3 next is the way to go. Once you consolidate your position and black is unable to target your pawns, later you will be able to mobilize your rook and try to win that pawn on a7. However, king g2 was played and black played the move a5. That's a very nice idea, so it will be harder for white to march forward with its pawns. White goes for the move f3, and now the move knight to e6, attacking the rook. The rook wants to stay on the d-file, keeping the knight defended, attacking the knight on e6, but now the knight comes in to f4, and that's a very nice square for the knight. Black is definitely having counterplay at this point, and it's not easy what white should do here. Hikaru played here this move king f1, and the king is stepping out of all sorts of checks. If it would have been on f2, there's There's a potential knight check on d3. And one of the ideas is that black doesn't have the chance here to simplify with the move a4. The idea is that if pawn captures, you can take on a3. But now there is this key move, rook to d4, and both the knight and the pawn are hanging. And had the king been on f2, there would have been knight d3 check. That is the main difference. So no a4. Black goes for the move knight to d3 immediately. And white plays a4, preventing black from going for that pawn break. Knight goes to c1, so black is about to win the pawn on b3. Pawn has to be defended. And now the rook comes to e3, so cutting off the king, and white is stuck with its king on f1. If you go king f2, it's rook e2 with a double attack winning the knight. So white instead played the move rook to b5. And here various moves are possible. I don't think white is really threatening to take on a5, because you have the idea to capture on b3, and black will be all right. So something like king g6, bringing the king to the center, seems very logical. But Cheparinov goes for this move, knight to d3, with the idea to go rook check, and after king g2, go back with the rook to the second rank, winning the knight. So the knight goes to c4, and I think this is a very sharp position, because black had the option now to take on f3, but he didn't play it. I think after king e2, there's this little problem. The rook got to keep the knight defended. And, well, there are some tactics. If you take on a5, there is knight c1 and you win the pawn back on b3. So rather than taking on a5, you may start with this move, king to d2. And next, this pawn on a5 will be taken, and it's gonna be a very sharp race later on. But it looks as if white's pawns are definitely more threatening than black's pawns on the king side. Anyway, rook e1 was played instead of capturing the pawn on f3, king to g2. And look now, g5 is played. It's getting sharper and sharper at this point. And this is not easy at all. But what is the idea of this move g5? Well, if white would take the pawn on a5, there is the move rook e2 check. And white cannot hide from the checks with the move king g3, because it allows knight f4, and on the next move it will be checkmate with the rook on g2. That's a very fantastic mating pattern with rook, pawn, and knight. So if you go back to g1 instead, it's rook e1, and it's a repetition of moves. So it's clear that with that move g5, you're trying to install that knight on f4. However, white could have played here this move, rook d5. That's absolutely insane. It was not seen by Hikaru. And the idea is that you're allowing here this move, knight to f4, check. It's a knight fork. And if the king goes away, you're counter-attacking the rook on e1. If you do take on d5, king takes e1. The knight endgame is easily won, because the pawn on a5 is gonna drop. There's another option to give a check first on e2 and then play the move king f1. There's still no time to take the rook on d5. And after that, well, white is just going to take on a5. And it seems as if white is just going to be able to convert eventually. So let's take it back. This moment after rook to d5, there are other options as well. Key idea is that after rook e2, now the king can actually hide on g3, because if you go knight f4, attacking the rook, threatening checkmate on g2, there is rook d2, and all the threats have been parried. It's no longer going to be made. White is either going to exchange the rooks or capture the pawn on a5. So rook d5 would have been a brilliant win, but instead Hikaru played rook b7 check. Now the king goes to g6, and remember that black is still about to deliver a perpetual with rook e2, rook e1, and if the king goes to g3, it's knight f4, as we have seen. So the rook goes back to d7, and here again, the idea is to be able to meet rook e2 with king g3, so that after knight f4, the rook is able to come back. That's why the rook is needed on the d file to attack the knight and to be able to come back to the second rank. So the knight cannot really go to f4. Therefore, knight c5 was played, attacking the rook on d7. And now, nice move, king to f1, counter-attacking that rook on e1. The rook went to c1, and there is rook a7, and knight takes b3. Material is even again. Knight takes a5 is possible, was not played. I think after knight takes, this rook endgame is very likely going to be a draw because the rook is behind the passed pawn. Black is about to put a rook on a3, and that should, for super grandmasters, not be too difficult to hold. So Hikaru, not interested in winning the pawn. He keeps the tension by playing the move knight to e3. And that's a fantastic idea because now, if white allows the rook to come to a1, it's knight f5, and it's the same mating pattern with colors reversed. Now it's white's turn to catch the king in this mating box. So therefore, after knight e3, knight f5 is the threat. Black has to stop it. Only move is knight to d4 to cover the f5 square. Now rook takes a5. White wins the pawn anyway. Rook to a1. We have that same rook endgame, but now with extra knights on the board. The knight comes to c4 so that the king is able to come to the center to support the passed pawn later on and chase the knight. But with correct play, black can hold here. If he goes rook a2 and now king e3, knight c2 is a very annoying move to face because after king e4, the king looks very active. But knight e1 is a fantastic savior because you're keeping an eye on that pawn on f3, and with a check or with another attack on that pawn, black generates counterplay. This was not played in the game. Rook a2 looks very strong, but instead I followed knight to b3. Now the knight goes to the wrong side. I think it would have been better trying to generate counterplay on the king side. Rook a7, so cutting off the king once again. Knight c5, attacking the pawn. The pawn comes to a5, and here still big moment because I think black should try to play f5 and get out of that mating box. If you take pawn, then it's absolutely unproblematic. More pawns are going to be exchanged. Maybe very soon g4 can be played. Remaining pawns will be exchanged. And remember, black only needs to sacrifice the knight for the two remaining pawns, and it's going to be rook and knight versus rook, which is a theoretical draw. Why did Cheparinov not play this move f5? I think it's because of this move, rook c7, attacking the knight. If the knight goes away, white also can give a check, forcing the king to go backwards, and then the pawn on f5 is hanging. But there is rook a2. That's a brilliant save. If you go back, then you keep on giving checks. White is unable to make progress. And if you play the move king to e3, then you're even losing now as white because black has this fantastic tactic with f4, giving a check, king d4 only move, and now it's knight to e6. It's a knight fork and you're even winning the game as black. How unfair would that have been? But instead, black didn't play f5, went for the move, knight to d3 check immediately. But now the king comes up the board and the position is really bad because white has a very simple plan of bringing up the king somewhere to the queen side to support that pawn, and that should be technically winning for white eventually. Black played here the move knight e5. I think that's a serious mistake. Other moves like knight c5 or knight to b4 could have been tried, and white is probably winning. But I don't know what Cheparinov had in mind here, but the rook endgame is just really, really bad. Rook a6 is a very clever check to force the king to go backwards. After king f7, the king comes into e4. You're about to win the pawn. Rook a3 played. King takes e5. Rook takes f3. Now the rook is no longer behind that passed pawn. And there's rook d6. And you're trying to push the pawn. And the rook will support the pawn from the side. Therefore, the rook gotta go back. And now after a6, rook a5, king d4. This is hopeless for black. Black even resigned already at this point. But let me show you why. White has a simple plan to come with the king to b4, attack the rook. Later, the king will walk to b7 to support the pawn. If black starts giving checks from behind, you're able to block with your rook. And this is what we call the umbrella technique in rook endgame. So the white king can easily hide against all these checks. For instance, if black tries to do something here with king e7, it's a rook h6. And that's a very important idea. After king f7, you just continue with king c4 and you follow your plan. But the critical line is, how about king d7? If the king walks to that pawn, well, then we have a nice tactic as we can advance the pawn to a7. The pawn cannot be taken because of rook h7 check. and you're picking up the rook on the next move. And if you play instead the move king to c7, well, there are various moves which are winning for white, but the simplest one is rook h8 to control the promotion square. You're threatening to promote the pawn, and now if black captures, it's rook h7 check anyway. The rooks will come off the board, and the king comes to e5, picks up the pawn, and the g-pawn will queen next. What an amazing effort by Hikaru Nakamura. He was in a sort of must-win situation, and thanks to this victory, he is now in the leading pack with some other players on 6.5 out of 9. So the tension is heating up, and in the penultimate round, he is going to face none less than Fabiano Caruana. So that's the All-American matchup. Let me know your predictions, and of course, let me know what other games you would like to see on the channel, and I'm happy to do that for you. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and see you soon again. Bye bye.